Chapter 19. The men were just leaving the house when I returned. "Annabel, where have you been?" my father said. "Your mother needs you inside." I went to let the animals into their stalls. My grandfather started up our truck while the others piled into the flatbed, a company of mutts with them. "Well, good," my father said, turning away. "Now go on inside and help your mother." "Wait," I said, following him across the lane. "Daddy, wait a minute." "Annabel, we've got to get going," he said as he opened the cab door. "The light's almost gone, and the bloodhounds are out at the church, ready to go. Daddy, I think I know where Betty is." Which stopped him cold. He closed the truck door. "You know where she is?" He looked askance, and I couldn't blame him. Just like that, I was filling the horse buckets at the cistern, and I remembered something. The light seemed so small compared to everything else. Andy told the trooper that Betty meant to go down to Toby's place and cause some trouble, so I figured maybe she did go down there when Andy didn't show up at the Turtle Stone. My father shook his head impatiently. "Annabel, Constable Leska went down there looking for Toby. Betty wasn't there, and the trooper went down there himself and had a good look around. She wasn't there. She isn't there, Annabel." But they were looking for Toby. They weren't really looking for Betty, because that was before they knew she might have gone down there to cause trouble for him. My father opened the door to the truck again. "I don't understand what you're getting at, Annabel. That shack is one room. There's no cellar, there's no attic, there's no closet, and there was no sign that she'd been there. Except that wire. Annabel, she didn't see anything from the belfry, Daddy. Toby didn't do anything wrong." My father climbed into the truck. "Annabel, I have to go." "Daddy, she's in the well," I said. He shook his head. "Toby doesn't have a well." He began to shut the door. "Yes, he does," I said, grabbing his arm. "There's one back in the woods at the old Cobb place." "Annabel," my mother called from the doorway. "It's just a hole in the ground," I said. "You could walk right past it." My father went still. "I'm sure someone has searched every square inch around there." "Betty said she was afraid of Toby," I reminded him. "Nobody thought she'd be anywhere near the smokehouse. Andy was the only one who knew she wanted to go down there that day." I couldn't tell him about the odd sounds I'd heard in the dark, like a frightened animal. "Annabel," my mother called again. "I'm going with Daddy," I called back. "Go on inside," he said. "We'll have a look in the well." "Please let me come along," I begged. "I won't get in the way, I promise." He considered me for a moment and then waved an okay to my mother. I climbed into the truck and sat between him and my grandfather, who was, thankfully, a slow and careful driver. By the time we got to the church, Toby would be getting close to Cobb Hollow. By the time my father told the handlers to keep the dogs leashed for the time being, Toby would be headed down the slope toward his smokehouse. By the time my father had told the constable to follow us down to Cobb Hollow, Toby would be waiting for us in the woods, with night coming quickly on. And by the time we found the well, Toby would be ready to join us, just one more stranger come to help, blending in like a chameleon. As we drove down the lane into Cobb Hollow, I recalled once more the sound I'd heard, a porcupine, I'd thought. I pictured Betty trapped deep in the cold well for 2 days, the rain pouring in on top of her, and I wasn't sure she needed more punishing for all she'd done, but I knew that Ruth might disagree. My grandfather pulled the truck down the Cobb lane and parked by Toby's smokehouse. Another truck pulled in behind him, the constable at the wheel, 5 more men with him. We all piled out and gathered in the clearing. "There's a well in those woods," my father called out, "back down the lane and some off to the left. Watch where you step." He grabbed my sleeve. "You stay right with me, Annabel. You understand?" I did. I wanted to be with him. If Betty wasn't in that well, if I was wrong about that, I didn't know what I'd do. And somewhere nearby, Toby was waiting to see what happened. I had to be close. I had to be the one to help him, if it came to that, and I wanted my father with me. The men fanned out and started through the trees. It was dark enough, so one by one the flashlights came on, bobbing and shifting, guiding us forward. The burned-out foundation of the Cobb house was easy to find, but it took longer to locate the well itself, which was nothing more than a dark spot on the ground, the flat stones around it long buried in moss and rot. By rights, the whole too should have been covered over with leaves by now, and I knew without looking in that it had been, that Betty had stepped on it unawares, and that her fallen body had cleared it for us to find. I stepped back as the men converged around it. How horrible, how horrible, how horrible that she could be in there, that anyone could be in there. I hadn't thought about it before, not really, or I would have screamed it out and run to find her. The constable stepped to the edge and shined his flashlight straight down into the hole. "I can't see anything," he said. "John?" My father joined him, 2 others as well, and they made a circle around the well and pointed their lights together down the hole. "My Lord, she's down there," the constable said. "Betty!" And then it was all confusion as the men scrambled to the trucks for lanterns and rope and shovels. I stood clear, my back against a tree. I watched as Toby came out of the darkness and into the fray without a word. Nobody noticed anything, but here were 2 more hands to help pull her out of that well. He was wearing my grandfather's old gloves. He looked like a farmer, like my father, like Henry or James would look some day. In the end, it took a while to get Betty free. It was a dug well, once roomy enough for a man with a shovel, but then narrowed by the laid stones he'd used to line it. Betty was only about 20 feet down, the front of her poncho caught on a rusty old pipe, cradled in it as if from a stork's beak. She had been saved from falling all the way to the bottom, but her legs hung down out of sight, and we all wondered if they hung in November water. The men were worried about dislodging her, sending her deeper into the well, hurting her worse, or even drowning her. But they knew they had to get her out of there as quickly as possible. They called to her again and again, but she did not respond. When they dangled a rope down to her, and there was no way she could tie it around herself in any event. On the other side of the well, from where I stood with my father, Toby and the others watched. I met his eyes across that dreadful breach. In the lantern light, he looked younger, but even more serious than he ever had in his beard and black coat and hat. Someone needs to go down there and get her out, my father said. Yes, but we really ought to use a tripod and a winch, the constable said. We do this wrong, and the man we lower could end up falling in with her. You want to wait while someone goes after a winch, my father said. No, the constable said. No, I don't, and I'm sure Betty doesn't want to be down there for 1 minute longer than she has to be. I remembered the hours I'd spent picking milkweed pods, cutting Toby's hair. I remembered chatting with the horses as I gave them their oats. I remembered being glad that my grandfather was a slow and careful driver, and I felt sick. An oak standing near the well reached out above it with a sturdy limb. We all stepped back as my father tied a heavy knot in one end of the rope and tossed it over the branch to the constable, who pulled it down and looped it into a quick harness. I'll go, my father said, unbuttoning his coat, but Toby, standing next to the constable, took the rope out of his hands. Let me, he said. I'm skinny, but I'm strong. He kept his gloves on, but shed my grandfather's coat. I don't know you, the constable said, but he sounded nothing more than curious. I'm not from around here, Toby said, but I came to help, and I'd be obliged if you let me. I began to breathe again, though I realized that my hands were in fists as my father and the constable fit the harness around Toby, leaving a long tail that he could use to secure Betty. You sure about this? The constable asked him. She's pulling weight on the wall where she's caught, no telling whether the whole thing might not collapse and take you with it. The other men had made a ring around the well. I could see between them, Toby adjusting the harness, looking at the constable, nodding his response. Take my flashlight, the constable said. We won't be able to shine any light down past you, but I don't know how you're going to get her tied and hold the flashlight without another hand or two. I'll manage, Toby said. He reached into his pocket and handed my father his jackknife. Would you hold on to this for me? I'll be going in upside down, so. You have a wallet? Keys? Toby paused for a moment, then in my coat. As Toby knelt at the edge of the well, my father said, I didn't catch your name. Toby looked back over his shoulder. Jordan, he said, and it felt like the truth. By now, someone had fetched the Glengarrys, and they arrived in a state of panic. Betty's mother surprised in city clothes and pin curls. She cried a little as all the men lined up along that rope and slowly lowered Toby head first into the well. The oak limb bowed some, but it held, and the rope was thick enough to stand some fraying. At his weight, dragged it hard against the bark. They lowered him, hand over hand, until Toby called out in a muffled "Whoa!" which the constable echoed, his hand in the air. He's got to her, he called. Stop and hold it steady. We waited, the rope shivering. I pictured him tucking the flashlight under his chin, looping the rope around her. I heard him yell something else. He can't get the rope under her arms, the constable said. She's swaddled in that poncho. But if he moves it out of the way, it might come off that pipe. My father had his flashlight trained down the well, a lantern high in his other hand. He's going to have to grab her and pull her out himself. Can you get your arms around her? The constable called into the well. A long pause. The rope shivered some more. The men holding it leaned back against the pole. That's when we knew how badly Betty was hurt. From deep in the well, she screamed. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Betty's grandmother turned in tight circles, her head bowed, hands in fists against her mouth. I said my prayers, found it impossible that I'd waited for even 1 minute before telling my father what I'd gleaned from the soft whisper. That was no porcupine you heard. And I understood in the tiniest, palest measure why Toby carried those guns wherever he went. Above the well, the rope tightened and thrummed, Hold steady, the constable called again. He dropped to his knees and leaned into the well. Toby was yelling something, but I couldn't make out a word of it. She's stuck, the constable said, looking up at my father. When her poncho caught on that pipe, she must have slammed back against the other side of the well. There's a second pipe coming out just there behind her, and she's stuck on it. My father leaned in closer above the hole. What do you mean, stuck on it? It impaled her, the constable said. It's through her shoulder. I closed my eyes. There in that moment I thought I would never care about any small nonsense ever again, and Betty screamed and screamed. He's pulling her off that pipe, the constable said, and to the men on the rope line yelled, Get ready, he's going to be taking her weight. But they just flinched as one when the rope tried to cope with its new burden and the branch bowed overhead. And the constable yelled, Now heave, but slowly, standing again and signaling with his arm to heave, 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 until up came Toby's feet, his legs, all of him slowly up into the lantern light, and in his arms, tied against his chest and neck, a bundle of wet rags and matted hair, blue lips, blood streaming off the poncho, her legs drenched and limp, her face so white that I did not see how she could be alive. They laid Betty gently on a nest of coats in the flatbed of the constable's truck. She was conscious, but barely. When her teeth began to chatter, I was startled to find myself thinking again of a wild animal, groundhogs chattering, their teeth like that when dogs had them cornered. I pinched myself hard on the soft skin just under my chin. As Betty's grandfather covered her with his coat, I noticed that she was wearing her poncho inside out, the dark lining on the outside, the yellow hidden. And I pictured her creeping through Cobb Hollow into Toby's smokehouse, tucking the coil of wire under his bedding. I pinched myself again and turned away. It was impossible to know just how badly Betty was hurt, but we all knew that she needed to get to the hospital quickly. Where she had been impaled, her flesh was already green and swollen, and while she could wiggle her fingers, she couldn't seem to move her legs. She's been cold and still for a long time, my father said. It may be that she just needs warming. Betty's mother climbed into the front of the constable's truck while her grandparents and two men from the rope line took up spots in the back to hold Betty still. When another of the men offered to take Mrs. Glengarry's place, she waved him off. Thank you, she said, but no. If it was possible to hurry slowly, that's just what the constable did as he started the truck and ferried Betty off and away. And that left the rest of us to stand in a pool of lantern light and stare at one another, catching our breath and trying to slow ourselves down. I'm Jed Hopkins, one of the men said, holding his hand out until Toby took it. That was really something what you did. It was, said another man, offering his hand and his name, and then each of them in turn thanked Toby for what he'd done. We've all been spared a nightmare or two, Jordan, though I'm afraid you'll have them for us, my father said. I'm John McBride, and this is my daughter, Annabelle. Pleased to meet you both, Toby said. He was careful not to look straight at me. We spent a few moments coiling rope and covering the well with branches until it could be properly capped. Then, I guess we can go on home, my father said. I guess, I replied, looking around for Toby. I saw him standing near his smokehouse, his back to me. You all, my father said to the others, I'll give you a ride back to your trucks and you can go on home from there. What about him? I whispered, nodding toward Toby. Jordan, my father said, the stranger who asked us to lower him into a well to save a girl he'd never met. He's coming home with us.